Chapter 6. Dangerous Travel. Roland woke with his heart pounding. He'd been dreaming of a raven, wings as wide as the night sky, coming at his eyes, talons first. Roland wiped at his face with his sleeve, trying to scrub the image away. His shirt smelled like his mother's embrace. He covered his face with his hands and took deep breaths to keep from weeping. He felt as if someone had pressed a wedge to his heart and struck with a mallet, splitting him like firewood. All those years on the streets, he'd carefully hardened his heart, building calluses like the ones on his bare feet. He'd worked hard to mold himself into a tough, unbreakable street kid. It nearly brought a laugh to his throat. He was so tough and unbreakable, yet even the thought of his mother almost reduced him to tears. She'd been sick to madness. There was comfort in knowing that she hadn't abandoned him out of indifference, at least. And where had the Greencloaks been with their precious nectar and lofty promises when his mother had turned 11? They'd abandoned her too. The bile cures bonding sickness. This realization struck him with a force that nearly knocked him back. Abeka had insisted that Shane meant well, and here was proof that the Conquerors were doing good. They'd cured his own mother. His mother. He had a family again. Roland eased himself onto his hands and knees and started to creep toward his boots and cloak. The soft grass cuttings hushed beneath him. His hand pressed through the grass and hit a nail on the stable floor. Roland's breath hissed with pain and he fell. There was Maylin, her sleeping face turned toward him. He hadn't seen her look so peaceful, so content, in a long time. Not since before the Devourer and his forces had attacked them, unprovoked, and killed Maylin's father. Her family was gone, taken by the Conquerors, and now here his family was back, given to him by the same people. He looked toward the door, his muscles shaking with the effort it took to remain still. His mother was out there, waiting, hopeful. But if he went to her, she would take him to Zerif and those other murderers. He felt his leg muscles tense, ready to run to her anyway. So instead, there in the dark, he made a quick decision. "Maylin," he whispered, shaking her sleeping form. "Maylin, wake up." She bolted upright, hands defaulting into fists. "We need to go," he whispered. "Now." Maylin woke Tariq and Maya, while Roland shook Connor and Abeka. All put on their boots without asking questions. They passed near the house where Adana and her companions were sleeping. The window gaped open. Roland's muscles still shook, but he kept his gaze straight and did not look inside, not to see her face one more time, to make sure she was okay. It was almost worse not looking. In his mind he saw her sleeping restlessly, waking at dawn, looking for him, finding him gone. But he kept walking on without a backward glance, and his heart tore just a little more. Essex appeared, settling on his shoulder. The weight grounded his feet. Abeka and Uraza led the way, the leopard's eyes detecting the best path in the dark. The pair was completely silent. Roland followed Abeka through a break in the fence and waited until Samis was out of sight before speaking.
"Thank you,"
he said. The group moved in closer to Roland as they walked.
"For what?"
Connor asked, keeping the farthest back, as if uneasy about walking near him.
"Thanks for trusting me that it was time to go."
Roland pulled out the compass.
"Pia gave this to me. I think it will lead us to Suka, and I didn't dare risk Shane and the others overhearing us talk about it. I thought it best to leave while they slept." "Well done, Roland,"
said Tariq. Roland didn't admit the other reason. Perhaps if he ran, suddenly and quickly, he'd have the strength to leave Adana. And perhaps someday when the war was over, she'd have the strength to leave Zarif. The idea of a family, his own family, his mother, was a greater draw than any talisman in the world. Roland fell in beside Connor as they walked.
"Hey, Connor,"
Roland said quietly.
"Hey, Briggan."
The wolf turned his head and looked at Roland with those blue, unblinking eyes.
Roland sensed disapproval. "Listen, I just wanted to apologise,"
said Roland.
"I didn't get it, what you did, giving up the iron boar to save your family. It seemed selfish to me at the time. And, well, I get it now. That it was the opposite of selfish."
"Thanks," Connor whispered. "But I know it was horrible of me."
"It wasn't horrible of you," said Roland. "Or at least, not nearly as horrible as some of the other horrible things you've done before or since."
Connor stared, stunned.
"What?" "That stew, that meat grass abomination you made for us in Zhong was way more horrible. And that sheep joke you tell to everyone new we meet, horrible. And your stench, good gravy, it's like the past gas of the Devourer himself."
Connor gave a half smile. "You like the sheep joke. I know you do. I've seen you laugh."
"Yeah, you got me," said Roland. "But anyway, the boar thing? It was an impossible situation. And I've been a jerk to you. Sorry."
Briggan trotted closer, letting his furry back rub beneath Roland's hand, and they walked in silence for a few moments. Briggan was big. Not great beast big, but still fanged and furry canine predator big. On the streets, dogs were bad news. They'd fight you over scraps, or worse, chase you, snarling and rabid, one bite, certain death. Now here Roland was, walking beside a wolf, his hand resting in his grey fur. Uraza led the way with a Becker, but Meilin kept G in her passive state. Roland supposed the panda wouldn't be able to keep their brisk pace. Still, Meilin rarely let her spirit animal out, unlike Essex, who was always out. Roland could sense Essex off to his left somewhere, probably taking a rest in one of the trees, since she could fly faster than the group could walk. Roland whistled, 3 notes trailing up, their code for, "Come here, please." He heard the response, one falcon screech trailing down, Essex's way of laughing at him. He hadn't really expected her to come, but it would have been nice. The weight of the gerfalcon on his shoulder might have distracted him from the stinging weight in his heart.
"Have you been wondering how Shane and Zarif and all those guys always show up wherever we are?"
Connor asked suddenly.
Yeah," said Roland. "You think someone is feeding them information?"
Roland couldn't help glancing over at Abeka. She'd been awfully friendly with Shane.
"Not Abeka,"
Connor insisted.
"Then who?"
No way it was Meilin, or Tariq. Connor was just too honest and straightforward to be a spy. And Shane and Zarif had always seemed to find them, long before Maya had joined their group. Certainly it wasn't Roland himself. There had to be some other explanation. Tariq was leading the way, compass in hand.
"Normal compasses lead to the true north, the very top of the world," said Tariq. "This one appears to be leading us north-northwest. Perhaps it's tuned to Suka or her hiding place." "It better be,"
Roland muttered. It was dawn when they reached the rocky northern coast of Yura. With a lightening of the sky came a salty breeze that whisked over Roland's face, cold as a slap. At this point, only a narrow channel of the sea separated Yura from Arctica.
"There's a village on the shore across the water,"
Roland said, shielding his eyes from the glare of the cold sun overhead.
"Where?"
asked Connor, staring.
"Can't you see it?"
Roland pointed. "I don't see any land at all," said Meilin. just the sea.
Your vision is sharpening, said Tariq. Interesting. Yes, my map says there is an Ardu village on the coast. The Ardu only live in Arctica, but for a price, they will ferry people across the channel, usually Yoran hunters looking for seals or walrus.
Walrus, Roland said with a snort. He was determined not to be gullible. There was no such thing as a huge, tusked sea elephant.
We need a way to signal the Ardu village, said Tariq.
I got this, said Maya. She held her hand out, and her salamander, Teeny, scampered out of her sleeve and onto her palm. She whispered something to him, or breathed on him or something, and then carefully balled her hand into a fist with the salamander inside. She raised her fist above her head, and Roland heard a crackling sound, like the first twigs of a campfire catching heat. The air around Maya curdled with a smokeless heat, strands swirling, gathering slowly around her hand. He felt himself hypnotized, staring blankly at her shimmering fist. He started back a step when she opened her hand suddenly, and a ball of fire the size of a saddlebag popped in the air above their heads. It rose, flickered for a moment, and then faded. That good enough? Maya asked.
I think so,
Tariq said, smiling. Some time later, a petite, bearded man paddled over in a canoe. He wore a caribou hide cap with long flaps over the ears that dangled almost to his shoulders. The canoe was built of hides stitched together and stretched across a frame of animal bones, almost as if the canoe were the carcass of some hollowed-out beast. It reeked of fish and blubber. It was clearly a fishing boat, but probably all the boats were fishing boats there. Roland stepped in, wary of the way the boat moved with every small lap of water. Space was tight, so Briggan and Uraza entered passive state on Connor's and Abeka's arms. Essex circled far above. Roland smiled up. He felt a little grumpy with her for refusing to come, but if he could fly, he'd be up there too, finding a good breeze and letting it carry the weight away. Tariq paid the man a gold coin. He dipped in his oar and paddled away from the Yoran shore with surprising speed. Roland looked back, half expecting to see his mother standing there in the mist. She wasn't. Does everyone else have room for their feet, or am I the only one resting on a bed of dead fish? Abeka asked. I've just been throwing the more disgusting ones out as we go, Maylin said. The Ardu oarsman paused.
Excuse me?
Oh, Maylin said, and Roland saw an expression flicker across her face that he couldn't quite pin down. It looked like embarrassment, but Roland didn't think Maylin had experienced that particular emotion ever in her entire life. She cleared her throat and wiped her hands on the sides of the canoe. I'm sorry, that was probably your food. I swear they were just the mangled ones you wouldn't have wanted to eat. The Ardu turned, examining the water behind them.
Not all creatures are so picky, he said.
Suddenly, the canoe lurched as if struck by a large rock, but there were no rocks nearby, no shore and no land, only water, and what might be in the water.
Take this,
shouted the Ardu, giving Tariq the only other oar.
Strike it when it surfaces, otherwise paddle.
Roland and the others began to scan the water, moving about nervously.
Stay still, Tariq said. You risk toppling the craft without the help of the beast. Beast? Roland asked. What beast? There are predators in the water, Roland, said Tariq, the same as on land.
A keening roar rose from the side of the craft, and Tariq struck something in the water that sounded like the flank of a wet horse. Roland grabbed a handful of fish from the bottom of the canoe.
Should I throw some out? He yelled, to distract it. No, shouted the oarsman and Tariq in unison.
What could they do? Uraza or Briggan couldn't fight a creature in the water. The talismans seemed useless here. The granite ram's leaping ability and slate elephant's power to enlarge a spirit animal offered no way to battle a sea creature. And how could they fight something they couldn't see? There was another hard thump on the canoe. The Ardu kept paddling, faster and stronger than Rolan imagined someone that small and that old could manage. Lumio sat on Tariq's shoulder, and the man put his hands in the water.
"Tariq!"
Connor shouted. Rolan watched, eyes wide, waiting to see some great-jawed creature bite off Tariq's hands. But instead the water around his wrists shuddered, as if a stone had been dropped, sending out ripples on still water. Again the ripples, and a pulsing Rolan could feel beneath the boat. "Tariq?" Abeka asked.
"Lumio lends me some minor abilities with water," said Tariq. "I'm thumping at the creature with a push of water, hopefully encouraging it to leave us alone."
Several tense moments clawed past, and the oarsman's pace slowed.
"I can paddle,"
Rolan said, worried the man was too tired to outrun whatever sea monster was chasing them.
"I'm sure you can, boy," the man said, "but we wish to get to the shore, not splash about like a wounded seal." Rolan frowned. "I believe we have outrun the creature,"
Tariq said,
and the Ardu grunted. "Or at least it lost interest."
"Maybe don't give the giant people-eating sea monsters any more treats," Maya said, voice quivering. "Okay, Maylin?" The motion of the sea started to make Rolan so queasy he forgot to be scared. Or sad. Or mad at the undervaluing of his paddling skills. At last the rocky shoreline came nearer.
I'd thought Arctica was all ice," said Tariq. "Oh, there's plenty of ice. Don't worry about that," said the Ardu with a mischievous smile. "Wait, you haven't ever been here before?" Rolan asked.
Tariq shook his head.
"But I have longed to. I want to know Erdas in all her different forms of beauty."
Rolan clambered out of the animal skin boat and into the Ardu village. Small huts made of mud and grass bricks faced the sea. An elderly woman with bright blue eyes and a face like a raisin came out to meet them. Tariq spoke with her for some time, asking advice about how to survive in the icy north of Arctica. "None live on the ice but those Ardu who bear a mark," she said. "My son drank the nectar and bonded with a snow hare. He left us to live in the ice lands with his uncle, who had bonded with an ermine. Only those who have bonded with northern beasts can bear the eternal snows."
"Have you visited their village?"
Tariq asked. The woman shook her head.
"They come to visit us here. We wouldn't know where to find them."
It was good they had Pia's compass, Rolan thought.
"There is much more hospitable land in Yora," said Connor. "Why do you live here?"
"We love it here," she said. "Our marked relatives know where to find us. The wind and waters know us. And some nights we lie back and watch the sky dance."
Sky dance? Rolan wondered if the cold and loneliness were getting to the Ardu people's heads. The Ardu were happy to sell them provisions for the journey, as well as cold weather gear, hooded cloaks made from thick caribou fur, gloves extending nearly to the elbow, high boots with rough-shod soles, the nails hammered only halfway through to better grip the ice. So much leather and fur. Rolan was sweating immediately, drops rolling down his back. It tickled and itched, as if spiders crawled beneath his clothes, and he cursed the ridiculously heavy clothing. Give him cold over heat any day. Within a few hours, he'd changed his mind. Dirt led to snow, which led to ice. Endless ice, more than an ocean's worth, it seemed to Roland. The ice was mostly flat, with subtle rises and crests, as if mimicking the waves of a gentle sea. A fine layer of snow lay over the ice, chased by flickers of wind. The sunlight was bright, reflecting off a white world so that there was nowhere to look that didn't hurt the eye. After several hours of walking, Roland closed his eyes and tried walking blind. Roland squinted his eyes open to get his bearings and noticed spots of black on the ice in the distance. Then they moved. The black spots were a nose and eyes.
"Polar bear,"
Tariq whispered.
"Suka?"
asked Maylin. Tariq shook his head.
"Far too small, but even a regular polar bear is the most fearsome predator on land. We would be wise to avoid it."
They took a longer route, attempting to stay away from the polar bear's hunting ground, and then continued on north. They walked a half-hour in peace until a snowbank immediately to their left unexpectedly moved, proving it had not been a snowbank at all. The polar bear rose to its full height, and the team froze. This terrifying creature couldn't be a regular polar bear, could it? "Suka?" Roland squeaked. The bear opened a mouth the size of G's entire head and roared. Roland noticed blood staining the fur around the bear's mouth, and he drew back in terror. The bear lunged and swatted with a long arm, the black claws of its paw just missing Roland. He had already stumbled backward in fright, and now fell flat onto the ice. But Briggan moved in fast, hunched low, warning the bear off with a growl, bark, bark, growl, bark, bark. Uraza was loose and crouched, a threat gurgling in her throat. Maya fumbled off her gloves, closed her eyes, and smacked the fist of her right hand into the palm of the left. Sparks exploded out from her body like someone dropping a heavy log on a dying fire. The sight was spectacular, but the sparks dissipated quickly, even before hitting the ground. The bear watched the sparks fade, and then swung one heavy paw at a nearby snowbank, icy snow cracking with a sound like broken bones. Snow showered over the team, and chunks of ice went flying. A piece the size of his fist struck Roland in the shoulder, and he sprawled back to the ground. When he wiped the snow from his eyes, he saw the bear several meters off, lumbering away in no apparent hurry. The polar bear, it seemed, had no predator to fear among their group. They all watched in silence as the bear disappeared into the white plain, its fur indistinguishable from the Arctican surroundings. "That was my big move," Maya whispered, "and it didn't even flinch."
"That was a regular polar bear," said Roland. "It was huge." "Suka will be much, much larger," said Tariq. With Briggan alert for polar bears, sniffing and stopping to look as they walked, Roland soon fell into a drowsy complacency. Surely no other danger could accost them out here. After all, nothing was visible but flat ice for miles and miles. The walk was beyond wearying. The scenery never changed, just whiteness, the glare of sunlight. Beneath all those layers, he was sweating, feeling sticky and itchy across his back and under his arms. But his uncovered face was glaringly cold, nose running and eyes streaming, teeth in a permanent state of chatter. "Maylin, did any of your tutors in Zong teach you how to keep from shivering? I could use a lesson."
There was a sound to his left, like a huff of breath and a moan. Was she annoyed with him for just asking that? He turned, feeling surprisingly hurt, and saw no Maylin at all.
"Maylin?"
he said. No sign of her. Anywhere. Roland's stomach plunged. He shouted for her, hurrying back toward where he'd last noticed her out of the corner of his eye. He tended to keep Maylin in the corner of his eye a lot lately. Essex screeched, startling Roland as she landed on his shoulder. her talons pressed against the front of his shoulder as if warning him back. With the contact, his vision became even sharper. His awareness of his surroundings increased. He detected now a subtle difference in the ice that lay before him, and beyond it, a hole. Carefully walking around the different-looking ice, he moved toward the hole. Lying on his stomach, he peered down. A crevasse about 2 feet wide and perhaps 100 feet long had riven the solid ice. A thick layer of ice and snow had coated over it, camouflaging it with the nearly identical solid ground. The crevasse was so deep that sunlight couldn't reach the bottom. And Maylin was clinging to the rough edge of the crevasse's icy cliff, about 10 feet down. She looked up at him, her face a mask of panic, her frown frozen. She seemed unable to speak, to move, to do anything but keep gripping the tiny ledges in the ice. One slip, and she'd fall.
"Maylin!" Roland shouted. "Help! She's fallen!"
Roland almost called for the slate elephant. Wearing it would make Essex large enough to carry Maylin, but the crevasse was too narrow. Great Essex's wingspan would be too wide to fit. But apparently Abeka had had the same idea, because Roland heard rolling thunder beside him. It was Uraza. Great Uraza, huge Uraza. Clearly Abeka was wearing the slate elephant, making her spirit animal the size of a great beast. The deepest parts of Roland wanted to scream and run from the enormous thing charging at him, but he just stared. Uraza was like a monster from a storybook, a giant terror that shouldn't exist. He watched as a tremendous paw landed next to him, each claw the size of a man's arm, cracking into the ice, anchoring the giant cat to the frozen plain. Uraza's huge shoulder muscles rolled as she crouched and extended one long arm. She couldn't quite reach Maylin. She crouched even closer to the cliff, knocking bits of ice down the crevasse. She reached lower. Her paw just managed to extend to Maylin's shoulder. Maylin hesitated to let go of her precarious hold on the cliff to grab the paw. Roland heard her short, panicked breaths.
"Let go, Maylin," he said. "She's got you. Let go. It's going to be okay."
Though he didn't feel like it'd be okay, Maylin was 1 inch from falling into a bottomless crevasse. "Okay," Maylin breathed out. She let go, clawing at Uraza's paw, hanging on by gripping handfuls of fur. Uraza pulled her up slightly, curled her paw, and then batted her into the air as if she were a toy ball. Maylin rose, flying out of the crevasse, emitting a strangled scream. Uraza caught her in her paws, setting her down on the ice.
"Are you okay?"
Roland asked.
"Are you all right? Maylin?"
Maylin stood on her feet, straightening her spine. "I feel a great deal like a mouse," she said, wobbling slightly.
"What happened?"
Connor asked. Maylin cleared her throat, as if trying to get her voice to stop shaking. "It would seem that some ice is false ice, covering deep holes." Uraza began shivering, and the ground shuddered with the sheer magnitude of it. Abeka lifted the slate elephant so it was no longer in contact with her skin, and Uraza flickered back to big kitty size. Then Abeka pulled up the sleeve of her coat, and the leopard became a mark on her skin. "Some of us are more accustomed to warmth," she said. "My pack fell down," Maylin said, "and with it, 1/3 of our food." Everyone groaned. They'd been travelling light as it was. Tariq had them all unpack, divvying up the remaining food equally between all the packs.
"It was foolish of me to put all the food in only 3 packs, he said. "I'm sorry, team, but the days will be lean."
Roland shouldered his new pack, full of food, a bedroll, and part of their tent. It was heavy, though he wished it were heavier with food. He got an uncomfortable feeling they were about to starve in this icy desert. Tariq brought out his long, thin rope, knotting it through everyone's belt with several feet between. "Better keep animals in passive form," he said. "We don't have enough rope to secure them to us, or food to spare to feed them." "Sure, let me just—" Roland pulled up his sleeve, whistling to Essex. She whistled back that dipping, laughing note. "Huh, Essex won't obey me. What a shocker." "We don't even know how far we have to go," said Connor. "We could run out of food before reaching Suka." "Do you wish to return?" asked Tariq. Connor considered, then shook his head. He pulled up his sleeve, and Briggan disappeared. Roland sighed and looked up at Essex. "Did you see that, girl?" Roland said. "Come on now, you pretty birdie." He offered her his arm with his most charming smile on his face. Essex landed on his shoulders and ruffled his hair with her beak, like an older sibling rubbing a fist against a younger brother's head. A gerfalcon was native to northern climates anyway, and she could hunt for herself. Passive state offered her nothing that she wanted or needed. Though for Roland, the ache in his chest still as real as the ice beneath his feet, the chance to be unconscious for a while sounded like bliss. They camped each night, all six huddled in their small tent. Roland was too cold to sleep deeply, too aware of the others twitching in their sleep, breathing, snoring. Each morning he woke up feeling as if he'd been in an overnight street brawl. All day they walked, the monotony of ice, snow, and hunger interspersed with the constant threat of death by falling. Tariq had rationed the food to a hand's breadth of meat jerky, one dry travel biscuit, and one apple each day. Hungry and bored, they played a game as they walked called Best Meal Ever. "Hot pepper sauce over antelope steak," Abeka said. "Heaps and heaps of black grapes. Honeyed bread braids with goat's milk pudding." "Just bread," Roland said, brushing snow off his coat. "A huge loaf of hot bread, crusty on the outside, soft as a sigh on the inside, smeared with melty butter and a great deal of raspberry preserves." "Raw, fresh tuna, juiced with lemon and ginger, over a hotbed of sweet rice," said Maylin. "Mangoes so fresh they're creamy and—" Maylin dropped. "Crevasse!" Roland shouted. "Hurry! Crevasse! Crevasse!" He held tight to the end of his rope that secured him to Maylin and was scrambling for a foothold on the ice. The others were digging in too, Connor beside him, but the rope was slack. Maylin hadn't fallen down a crevasse. Maylin stood up, dusting herself off. "I just tripped," she said. "How embarrassing." Roland was the one who felt embarrassed at his overreaction. He felt his cheeks colouring. "So, Connor said you keep falling because you're so heavy, but I defended your honour," he said, helping brush snow and ice chunks off her hood and arms. "I said no such thing," Connor shouted, and Roland gave him a grin. "I am heavy," she said. "It's all these brains." She tried to smile at Roland, and the failure of it made his chest ache anew. They began walking again. Roland tried whistling quietly to Essex. If the falcon sat on his shoulder, he might be able to detect the crevasses before Maylin fell again. Essex swooped down, knocking his hood back with the air of her passing, but wouldn't land. "Mutton pie," Connor was saying, "with egg-basted, flaky crust, stuffed full of tender mutton and potatoes and carrots, and covered in thick, hot, salty gravy." Roland had never tried mutton. The Greencloaks served it sometimes at Greenhaven Castle, but with so many other choices, He'd turned away from meat that smelled exactly like what it was, old sheep. But just then, mutton sounded like the best idea since there was no ground. Roland was falling. "Crevasse!" he heard someone shout from above. All he could see was a rush of blue ice and blackness under his feet. He felt his gut loosen and the muscles along his spine tighten and twitch, as if trying to flap wings he did not have. His entire body ached with an explosion of fear bursting out from the center of his body. The world was quiet and as slow as an exhale, and he seemed to have a lifetime of a moment to realize that he was about to die. No ground beneath him, nothing but darkness. A hard yank on his middle. Though it had felt like forever, he'd only fallen as far as the rope between him and Meilin. Through the crack, he heard more shouts now. They sounded desperate. He held onto the rope, scrambling with his feet on the ice wall, trying to find traction that did not come. His feet kept slipping. A sound like thunder, and then Grey Turaza's paw lowered. Roland reached up, the cat stretched down. But they were still a foot apart. The rope was too long. Roland clawed at the ice wall, hoping to find a handhold, but just drew back a chunk of ice. "I can't get up," he yelled. "I'm stuck! I'm stuck!" "Take a deep breath," he heard Tariq call. "We'll pull and you'll push. We've got you." Roland breathed, shallow gasps, leading to one slow, deep inhale. This was not a street crew, ready to abandon him at the first sign of trouble. They had him. They would not let him fall. He felt a pull on his middle, and he angled his feet to climb the side of the crevasse and then haul himself back onto land. He brushed himself off with shaking hands. Essex landed on his shoulder. "Hey, Essex, great job scouting for crevasses," he muttered. Essex nuzzled her beak into his hood, bit onto a hair, and yanked it out. "Ow," he said, but something about the gesture actually seemed sweet. "That was horrifying," said Maya, staring aghast at the hole that had almost been Roland's grave. She started to walk, pacing in a circle. "I mean, that was really, really horrifying. I hate heights, and you'd think here on the ground you'd be safe from heights, but then those holes appear like monsters from beneath ready to grab you and—" "Maya!" With Essex on his shoulder, Roland could see a slight difference in the ice. "Maya, stop!" Maya froze. She looked at Roland with wide eyes, and then down by her feet. She stomped her foot near the crevasse, and a chunk of ice tumbled away and down into a hole that had not been there a moment ago. She watched the ice fall, through loose strands of red hair fallen out of her hood and whipping against her face in the wind. Tariq put his arm around her shoulders and helped her slowly step back. "Good catch, Roland," Tariq said. "Let's keep moving." "Pear and cream cheese tarts," Maya said, her voice trembling, "and an entire roast chicken." After a few more falls and near misses, the group was exhausted, but they had no choice but to keep trudging forward. Even with his sharpened vision, Roland could see nothing but ice desert in every direction. He was too tired, too hungry, too hopeless to find any joke in the matter. At least Essex must be getting fed. She left him to fly out, returning perhaps an hour later to sit on his shoulder. But Roland noticed he hadn't seen any blood on Essex's beak or talons, smelled no meat on her breath. "Couldn't find anything out there?" Roland asked softly. Perhaps offended, Essex took flight. "Wait," said Roland. He sighed heavily and put his mitten in his pocket, pulling out his rationed piece of jerky for the day. His stomach instantly growled, as if furious with him, but Roland held it aloft. Essex swooped back, taking the jerky with her beak. She sat on his shoulder while eating it primly, holding the jerky in one talon. Roland's stomach protested again, and Essex stopped eating as if she'd heard. There was one small shred of jerky left. She held it in her beak and tucked it into his mouth as if he were a baby bird. Roland made a noise of surprise, but Essex chirped insistently, so he chewed. Essex stayed on his shoulder for the rest of the day. With her near, Roland led the way, able to detect the difference in the ice that hid the crevasses. That night, the others were so exhausted they fell asleep at once. Though Roland's body felt bruised and spent, his mind couldn't stop thinking. Ma, he thought. Had he done the right thing to run away? The bile cures bonding sickness, he thought. My mother returned for me. Are the conquerors really just bad guys? He knew he was doing good with the Greencloaks, but there was more to the story than they were telling him, and that made him nervous. He slipped out of the tent to search for Essex, but looked up with a gasp. At first he thought smoke filled the sky, only the smoke was green and tinged with purple. But the colours moved like a slow-flowing river, lower than the stars. Arctica was wild, wicked, and dangerous, but he understood a bit why the Ardu stayed. He leaned back, looking up as long as his legs would allow. Roland smiled, and the sky danced. Chapter 7. Compass. Their 5th day in Arctica dawned with a strange green hue. Abeka stared through the flap of the tent at the unnatural shade of sky, trying to warm herself with it, convince herself she was okay. She didn't remember sleeping all night. It felt more like she'd been knocked over the head and thrown onto the ground and had just laid there, feeling woozy with cold. She exhaled heavily and watched her breath crystallize in the air above her, and then snow back down onto her face. Full morning came. The sunlight turned bright gold, but the air felt no warmer. Still, Abeka told herself she was okay. At least a mountain range in the distance now gave them a destination to walk toward in the otherwise endlessly flat ice. The imaginary meal game continued. For the 7th course, Roland was saying, trout in a great deal of butter and stuffed with lemons and thyme, broiled till its skin is crispy. Abeka was too cold to be hungry. She was shivering so hard she tripped and fell 3 times in 1 hour. The 3rd time, Connor helped her back up. Are you okay? He said. Yes, she was okay. Hadn't she been telling herself that for days? Surely the others were as cold as she was. Just because she'd grown up in the hot plains of Nilo didn't mean she couldn't handle a few days on ice. But she couldn't get any of those words through her chattering jaw. Connor frowned, removed his scarf, and started to wrap it around her neck. Abeka was surprised how much warmer she already felt. She tried to move her lips into a smile, though they felt like ice. Connor smiled back anyway. To Abeka, family had meant a father and a sister who lived in the same house, ate with her, scolded her, wished her different. Not until meeting Connor had she understood what it might be like to have a brother. Not till knowing him and the others had she begun to imagine a different kind of family. She started to say thank you, but surprised herself by saying instead, I haven't been able to feel my feet for a long time. Sit down, Tariq ordered at once. He pulled off her boot and sock, and Abeka sucked in her breath. While her skin was naturally deep brown, her toes had turned an unnatural black. Frostbite, said Tariq. He began to vigorously rub her feet, and his touch felt like hot daggers. Abeka pressed her lips together to keep from screaming. I know it hurts, Tariq said, but we have to get blood flowing again, or you could lose your toes, or even more. Connor sat beside Tariq, removed Abeka's other boot and sock, and began rubbing. Now Abeka did cry out. The pain was one thing, but the humiliation was almost unbearable. She began, leaning forward.
Stop it,
Connor said, almost as if he knew what she was thinking.
On a snowy night watch, and shepherds can get frostbite. I've done this before, so stop worrying and just let me help.
Abeka covered her face with her hands. In one way, a boy her own age was rubbing her foot, and that made her want to dig a hole to crawl in and die. In another, her friend Connor was rubbing her foot, which was one of the kindest, most humble things anyone had ever done for her. This is what family does, she thought. Shane had said to her, so long ago now it seemed, that they must find family wherever they could. She lowered her hands from her face. "Thank you," she managed to say at last. Her feeling restored, they all hobbled on, finally reaching the mountain range that had been on the horizon for 2 days. It wasn't until she stood at its base that Abeka really understood its height.
I would never attempt to scale such a mountain if our compass did not point that way, said Tariq. We don't have enough food stores to waste time looking for a way around.
Mountain was perhaps the wrong word, because Abeka could detect no rock in it. It seemed, rather, that long ago, in a great act of violence, something had erupted up from below, pushing a range of ice onto the surface. Huge shafts of deep blue ice jutted together, building up and rising so high that Abeka expected to see clouds at the peak. They all sighed. "Up," said Maylin. They began to climb. Abeka instantly wished for Uraza. With the enhanced abilities the leopard's presence gave her, Abeka would have no trouble leaping from pinnacle to pinnacle. But it was too cold for the leopard, and there was no food for her. They climbed for hours, and though they were so far above the tundra floor that looking down made Abeka feel dizzy, they didn't seem to be any closer to the peak. Staying roped together saved them again and again. Climbing on ice was just a bit slippery. By evening, Abeka felt so weak her forearms shook, even when she wasn't gripping ice. The others were flagging too.
"Camp,"
Tariq called.
"What camp? How?" Roland said. "We're on the side of an ice mountain."
Tariq handed him what looked like a nail used to build a house for a giant.
"Take the mallet from your pack," he said, "and hammer the tent's corner to the ice."
In a matter of minutes, their tent was hanging like a curtain off the side of the mountain, the 6 of them behind it.
"Cozy," said Roland.
Abeka and Connor looked at him like he was insane.
"Joking,"
he muttered, as if out of energy to explain, lie, or continue the joke. Tariq slid along the cliffside and pointed at a spot, speaking to Maya. She placed her hands on the ice, a dim glow visible between her fingertips. With a crack, bubble, hiss, ice changed to water, and water to steam, forming an indentation in the ice that, to Abeka, looked just big enough for a loaf of bread.
"No larger,"
Tariq said, and Maya made 5 more. "What are these for?" Maylin asked.
"These are your beds for the night,"
Tariq said, cramming his own backside into one of the divots.
"Beds?" Roland said. "I'd be lucky to be able to sit in something that small." "Then they are your chairs for the night," Tariq said. "Get some rest as best you can."
Abeka had just drifted asleep when a sound like tiny fists punching at the tent woke her. Peering out from under the flap, she looked up the mountainside to see thousands of chunks of ice rolling down. "Avalon!" she started to yell, but Tariq reached over and grabbed her arm.
"Peace," he said. "It is only a hailstorm. Falling ice. Frozen rain."
Ice falling from the sky? Abeka leaned back into her hollow of ice, trying again to sleep. The side of a cliff wasn't her idea of cozy. She could feel the cold creeping back into her boots. Working again.
at her toes.
They all rose at dawn, exhausted but tired of trying to sleep. The short night had worn them down, like wind beats at sandstone, and every step felt like trying to roll a boulder. Abeka was just about to say she wasn't sure she could make it, when Connor slipped. He was roped between Maya and Rolan, but they were too groggy to catch him. The weight of 3 people pulled on Abeka's rope. She couldn't stop her slide. She scrambled for a hold, anything, her feet skimming over clear blue ice. And then came the sickening feeling of a fall. She jerked to a stop, the rope digging into her waist with the force of her own weight. She gasped, trying to reclaim the breath yanked out of her, dangling above a cliff. She looked up. Tariq was braced against an ice boulder, straining to keep hold of the cord that secured them all together. And he was slipping. Abeka's unsupported weight was too much to hold on the slope of ice. Her weight was going to pull him after her, and with him, Maylin. Abeka pulled her knife from her belt sheath and cut the rope.
"No!"
said Tariq. But Abeka was already falling. She seemed to go a long way before suddenly thudding onto Rolan, who was perched on a ledge 10 feet down. Her head hurt. Her knife was gone, knocked from her hand in the impact, and inches from her head, a sheer wall of ice dropped down 200 feet. She didn't dare to so much as twitch, afraid she'd slide again. Maylin and Tariq stood above, eyes wide and desperate. "Rolan, use the slate elephant," said Maylin. Now that Maylin said it, Abeka wondered how she hadn't thought to suggest that before. The lack of food was making her thoughts sluggish, and great ideas seemed to be as far away as warmth.
"It's in my pack,"
said Rolan. There was no hope in his words. Rolan was gripping the ice as firmly as she, inches from sliding down the cliff. "Where's the granite ram?" said Abeka.
"I have it,"
said Tariq.
"Give it to Abeka," said Rolan. "Get her to safety, and hopefully Essex will cooperate and fly it back to someone else."
Tariq carefully dropped the granite ram to Abeka, mindful of the cliff. Abeka didn't take time to put the chain around her neck, slipping the talisman directly inside her coat. She winced at the cold touch of stone against her skin. Instantly, she felt confidence in her limbs. Her eyes seemed to adjust, as if seeing the world not as a series of objects, but spaces between perches. Carefully, she moved off Rolan. What had seemed a treacherous cliffside now felt comfortable. She offered Rolan her hand, helping him to his feet and to a slightly safer ledge. She adjusted her feet, preparing for a jump, but the movement sent her sliding off the ledge. Facing a 100-foot drop, Abeka slammed her foot down and leaped. Her legs no longer shook from exhaustion. Her mind felt firm. She knew exactly what she was capable of, and she leaped up the mountainside, covering in minutes a distance that had taken them hours. She paused briefly at the summit to see if the view revealed anything of their location and Suka's hiding place. But all she could see was more icy tundra. Down she jumped, from ice outcropping to thin ledge to precarious ice boulder, with a speed and balance that filled her with awe. She landed on the flat ground and looked up, searching for Essex. She waited. No gerfalcon. The granite ram was useless if she was left alone on the safe side of the mountain. Then, a slow, circling shape. Essex landed near her. She didn't look at Abeka, as if pretending she was just hanging out on an ice boulder for her own amusement. But when Abeka held out the granite ram, Essex grabbed the cord and flew back up the mountainside. By the time the final party member had hopped down the mountain, they began to set up camp in earnest. Real camp, with an upright tent and flat spaces to sleep. Maya made a fire to warm them, though without fuel to burn she could not keep it up forever. Still, she melted ice in their cups and they all had a hearty drink of warm water before bed. Abeka woke on the 6th morning, firmly believing today the grueling journey would end. Suka was near. The compass seemed to indicate that. A couple of hours into their walk, the compass began to twitch softly in Tariq's hand. 2 more hours after that, it was constantly vibrating. So everyone's eyes were on the compass when, all of a sudden, it shook so hard the cover flipped open. Inside what should have been solid metal was a hollow compartment. Tariq sucked in his breath. Abeka leaned closer as he pulled a scrap of paper out. He unfolded it, revealing 2 handwritten words. "I'm sorry." Chapter 8. The Ardu. For several moments, no one spoke. Connor couldn't read the words on the note, but he guessed it couldn't be good. The compass had broken open. They were stranded in the middle of an ice continent, and there was no sign of Suka. "No," Maylin whispered. "No, that can't be right. That can't—" Maya began to weep. Abeka could not seem to move. Roland crouched down and punched at the ice.
"Roland,"
Tariq began.
"I didn't see it,"
said Roland.
"I was distracted by that woman, Adana, and I didn't notice Pia enough. She must have been lying. If only I'd looked. I'm so sorry."
Abeka kept shaking her head. Maylin was turning slowly in circles as if looking for something in that wasteland of ice. Connor saw nothing. A mountain range, a horizon. No city, nobody, no escape. Even if they walked south again, they'd run out of food long before returning to Yora. All this time wasted, conquerors on the move. Perhaps that rascal Shane had already found Suka, while the Greencloaks were wandering aimlessly through the most miserable landscape in Erdos. Connor sat down as if pushed by a huge weight. He'd left home, abandoned his family, with the hope that his mission was noble. To die listlessly on a sea of ice wasn't noble. It was pathetic.
"Still longing to see Arctica, Tariq?" said Roland. "Still eager to know Erdos in all her different forms of beauty?"
Tariq opened his mouth, but then seemed to change his mind about what he would say.
"Essex, perhaps, could help,"
he said softly.
"Essex, can you see anything?" Roland asked. "Please, fly high and use those sharp eyes."
When Essex complied, Connor felt worse. Even Essex must have realised how dire the situation was to do as Roland asked without so much as a squawk. With no better plan, they sat and waited, eating their meagre rations for the day. Connor hoped his stale biscuit and bit of jerky would digest into energy and faith, but his sore stomach just absorbed them like desert soil absorbs a cup of water, none the better for it. Maya warmed the group with brief bursts of fire and tried to renew the meal game, but the thought of food was too depressing. Tariq examined the compass, taking it apart piece by piece.
"It was a real compass once, but Pia damaged it. It was leading us to nowhere."
"She never intended to help us," said Roland. "She would lead us to our deaths to protect her own artificially extended life," said Maylin, her voice as hard as ice. Maya paced, and her breathing sounded strained, as if tightened against a sob. Essex landed on Roland's shoulder some time later. His shoulders slumped, making clear that Essex had seen nothing of use.
"At the top of the mountain, I didn't see signs of any city either," said Connor. "What city?" said Roland. "There aren't any cities in Arctica." "No, I mean the ice city. The song says that the great polar bear sleeps in the ice city." "If the song is true," said Roland. "Songs are always true, in their way," said Connor.
Abeka nodded, and Connor felt encouraged to go on.
"I mean, The song is how we knew about Suka's connection to Samis, and it was right about that. She wasn't there, but she had been. Maybe there's other truth in the words.
Connor cleared his throat, gripped his crook and began to sing. He didn't have a strong voice, but shepherds sang, so he had lots of practice, though he wasn't used to any audience besides a lot of disinterested sheep.
West of the sun, north of the drink, over the backbone of ice. Deep in the rime without a blink, the polar bear sleeps in ice. In Samis' home where she was known, they honour her with each breath. The bear breathes not one of her own in the ice city free from death. Hidden from the ruinous wind, they chisel city from snow.
Wait, do you think drink could mean ocean? Said Maylin, because we're already north of the drink. That range of mountains could be the backbone of ice, said Abeka.
So, we're looking for an ice city, said Connor. Where? Said Roland. Well, we're already north of the ice mountains, said Connor. The other clue is west, said Tariq. Yes, and there's a line in the last verse about the waters lap the falling sun. I bet Suka is nearer the western shore of Arctica. At the very least, the coast should provide us better hunting, said Tariq. Any hunting, Roland muttered.
So they struck west, and walked, the sun full in their face at sunset and pressing against their backs at sunrise. Connor tried not to count the days. Numbers made him feel hopeless. Numbers like 2, as in 2 biscuits left, and 0, as in 0 apples in his pack. And the morning they ate the last rations of food, someone began to cry. Maybe, Connor wondered, he was the one crying, or maybe they all were. He didn't have the strength to look up and see. A screech startled him. Essex was returning from one of her many scouting flights, but this time she was gripping something white in her talons. As she swooped down, Connor saw it was a snow fox, hardly enough to feed 6 people, but the idea of even a little fresh meat made his stomach squeeze so tightly in anticipation he doubled over in pain. But then the fox wriggled. Essex hadn't killed it. She was hovering before Connor, batting her wings quickly against the incoming wind to hold her position.
Take it, Roland insisted. Essex wants you to do something. Oh.
Connor grabbed the fox from Essex, holding it tight. Outside Samis, Briggan had turned the pack of wolves away from the caribou herd. Perhaps Essex knew that Briggan had some influence with other canines.
Roland, pull up my sleeve.
When his forearm was exposed, Connor released Briggan. The wolf shook his body, as if drying his fur after a bath, and immediately began prancing about, more like a playful puppy than an adult wolf.
Briggan, I know you're happy to be out, but can you talk to the fox? Find out if it knows where to find Suka, or find anywhere, really. Someplace we can get food and shelter.
Briggan sniffed the fox, howled, and then paced a quick circle.
I think he wants me to put the fox down, said Connor.
The moment Connor loosened his hold on the fox, it leaped onto the ground, stared at Briggan for a moment, and then took off to the west.
Come on,
Connor said, running after it. A destination fed his limbs better than a dry biscuit and bit of jerky. The weary, half-starved humans couldn't keep running for long. They slowed, and Briggan followed the scent of the fox, who was now far out of sight. Though surely not as strong as Briggan's sense of smell, Connor's own had sharpened, so that he thought he too could detect a slight musk on the ice. Roland was the first to see something on the horizon. As they drew nearer, Connor made out about a dozen low structures with rounded tops. They were built from the ice itself, blocks cut out, stacked, and sealed together with ice.
"The Ice City," said Connor.
"If that's a city, then I'm an army,"
said Roland. Several dogs had shown themselves, barking madly at the travellers. People stood behind the dogs, ivory-tipped spears and bone knives in hand. Connor could see many other animals: snow foxes, Arctican gulls, seals, snow hares and snowy owls, ermines, a musk ox, and 2 tall, great-antlered caribou.
"An Ardu settlement,"
Tariq said.
"I can't imagine they'll take kindly to strangers."
Briggan trotted forward and barked too. The dogs yipped, then quieted. An Ardu man with a spear came forward. The thick fur of his hood nearly hid his face, but Connor could see his pale eyes widen.
"Briggan,"
the man said in awe. He turned to the other people, speaking hurriedly.
"Time to impress,"
Roland whispered. Malin sighed and released G. Abeka let out Uraza, who stretched and yawned as if she'd just been napping. Essex settled onto Roland's shoulder, playing along. The Ardu leader laid down his spear on the ice. Behind him, the rest tossed down spears and bows, and G and the other spirit animals returned to passive state.
"The 4 fallen,"
said the man.
"Yes,"
said Tariq.
"They have returned and bonded to these special children. We need your help."
The man raised his hand for silence.
"The help you need immediately is food and warmth."
Tariq nodded, grateful. With the promise of rest, Connor felt the strength drain out of him, leaving his arms and legs cold. Maya collapsed against the ice. Tariq and Connor helped Maya up, and the Ardu led them inside one of the small domed houses. There was room for all 6 to sit, leaning against the walls of ice. An Ardu woman set a wide, shallow pan of seal fat on the floor and lit it. A smoky fire burned happily, warming the space. Soon Connor was drinking a mug of warm broth. The heat made him sleepy. He finished the drink and lay down. He heard someone else begin to snore, just before sinking into sleep himself. He must have slept the rest of the day, and all night too, because when Connor awoke it was morning. He stretched, luxuriating in the unfamiliar sensation of a great sleep. Their nights on the fields of ice felt like a long nightmare, and any sleep managed had been thin and cold, a ghost of itself. Tariq, Abeka, and Roland were also awake, and Connor crawled outside to meet them. He stretched again, just to feel alive.
"Not to trouble you,"
Roland was saying to the Ardu chief,
"but breakfast?"
The chief laughed.
"First we hunt so we can feast the heroes."
The Ardu hunters were already outfitted with spears and harpoons and setting off.
"We should go too,"
Tariq whispered.
"Hunting with the Ardu might help them trust us with any knowledge of Suka."
So the 4 of them followed the hunters. Connor did his best to appear energetic and competent, but he imagined the hunters to be silently laughing at the awkward children stumbling across the tundra. He had hoped it would be a short journey, but they walked an hour or more, during which Briggan looked like the only one of them having fun. The wolf would run ahead, diving headlong into snowdrifts and pouncing on things in the distance that might have been mice or might have been nothing. Suddenly, Uraza pounced, rolling Briggan in the snow. She pressed her paws against his chest and bared her teeth in what Connor could swear was a smile. The wolf yipped and scrambled free, and the 2 animals began to roll around and play-bite each other like a couple of pups. "Mine could take yours," Abeka whispered.
"No way! Dog beats cat,"
said Connor. One of the hunters shouted, as if announcing a find. As they caught up, Connor could see a hole in the ice, blue water filling it. Apparently in this part of Arctica, ice extended out over the ocean.
"A breath hole,"
Tariq said.
Seals, whales, and walruses who live in the ocean beneath the ice need to come up for air.
Roland snorted as if Tariq had told a joke.
Walruses,
he whispered. The hunter motioned everyone down with his hand, pointing at Briggan specifically and putting a finger to his lips. He then lay down himself. From a distance, in his brown furs and on his side, he resembled a seal reclining on the ice. The teammates all did the same. Connor lay with Briggan on one side, Abeka the other.
More walking and cozying up on ice isn't the best for frozen toes, he said. I'd hoped you'd get to stay at their village and stay warm.
I'm okay, she said. I'll just do my best to keep my feet from freezing. I don't want you to have to rub them again.
Me either, he said,
then felt stupid for saying it. It might have sounded to her like he hated the task, but he really just didn't want her to get frostbite again. He cringed behind his fur collar and waited, and waited, and waited, while his nose itched and his feet grew colder. This was a waste of time. Briggan was getting fidgety and so was he. They needed to find Suka. They needed to be up and fighting and stopping the devourer. A splash. A slick brown seal nosed up out of the water, flopping onto the ice. No one moved. 2 more seals followed. Still no one moved. Had they fallen asleep? And then, as if by some soundless command, the hunters jumped to their feet, spears in hand, spirit animals appearing. The seals darted back to the holes, but the hunters threw their spears. 3 spears struck the 3 seals, the wide ends catching. The seals slipped back into the water while the hunters clung to the ropes that were attached to their spears. Other Ardu rushed forward, hammering small metal stakes into the ice. The hunters holding the ropes pressed their boots against the stakes to keep from sliding on the ice and being pulled into the water hole. Connor and the others were all on their feet, ready to help, but soon the thrashing on the other end of the ropes stopped. The hunters pulled the seals back onto the ice and exclaimed, clapping each other on the shoulders. Despite his hunger, the violence of the hunting bothered him. He hid a shudder, glancing at Abeka. While he'd been tending sheep in Yora, she'd been hunting antelope in Nilo.
I guess it's the only way they eat, said Connor. No way to farm up here. Either they catch seals or starve.
Briggan padded around, sniffing the seals while the hunters lashed them with rope in preparation for a long walk back. Briggan stopped sniffing and stiffened, head cocked, listening.
What is it, Brig?
Connor asked. Then he heard something too. A low groan, like the sound of something very heavy slowly rolling across the roof of a house. If the house was a mountain and the something was the moon. He looked around. Abeka was watching the hunters at work. Roland was calling to Essex. Tariq was looking at him questioningly. Clearly no one else heard.
Hey, guys, Connor began. I think you should move away from...
The groan increased. Still no one seemed to hear. Briggan spooked away with a yip. Connor tried to determine where the sound was coming from. The ice. Below. There.
Abeka!
He yelled. He ran forward, grabbing her hand and pulling her away. Connor, what are you... Abeka was interrupted by a loud crack. The ice where she'd been standing was splitting. Everyone was running now, but the lengthening crack was faster, and in a moment, Tariq was gone. Connor saw the Ardu drop to their bellies, so he did the same, Abeka and Roland beside him. Essex flew over the hole in the ice, screeching. Nothing disturbed the bright blue water's surface.
Tariq!
Roland yelled, crawling forward. Connor followed him, thinking to hold Roland's ankles while he plunged in for Tariq. But then their green-cloak mentor appeared, thrashing and gasping. Something was pushing him up from underneath. Tariq clawed his way onto the ice. Roland grabbed his hand and helped pull, and they both scooted away from the crack. Behind them, the helpful seal emerged, sitting upright on the ice.
Don't kill that seal, please, Connor yelled.
One of the Ardu women let out a quick, rough laugh.
Of course not,
the hunter said. "She's my spirit animal." Connor stared, his mouth gaping for a moment, but quickly collected himself, hurrying over to help Tariq. Still, he couldn't help but wonder if that was an awkward relationship, given the woman's diet. Tariq was lying on the ice, shivering, his lips blue. "We should go at once," said the woman. "But, Tariq," Abeka started.
"He walks," said the chief. "In this cold, he must keep walking or he dies."
Tariq nodded. He walked. All but Tariq took turns dragging the heavy seals back to the Yardu ice village, where others took over, skinning the seals, preparing the meat. The women helped Tariq out of his wet clothes and into pieces of their own dry clothing. Other Ardu offered snow-packed chairs for the travellers. Some of the villagers brought out animal skin drums, and amid heavy drumming and loud singing, the feast began. Connor's stomach was rumbling, eager, until he saw the feast. Apparently the Ardu ate their meat raw. A woman handed Connor a pink wobbly blob with a glistening chunk of brown meat clinging to it. The pink parts were the fat, Connor quickly discovered. The Ardu sucked up the pink fat first, making slurping noises and humming contentedly. They made the fat sound so delicious, Connor's mouth actually started to water. He took a bite. It was not delicious. It tasted like cold, oily, chewy fat. But Connor considered that, in frozen Arctica, the more fat on the body, the warmer and healthier they would be. He slurped up some of the fat, swallowing it while holding his breath. The brown meat was smooth like raw fish and very salty. Connor felt as if he were taking a bite of solid ocean. The girls were offered bone cups filled with wiggly white stuff, as if it were a special honor. They ate it before learning that it was seal brains. "It was creamy," said Maya. Maylin just shook her head and looked a little green. Tariq held a small horn cup with a spoonful of the white stuff. He began to bob his head back and forth and sing. Seal brains, take some pains for seal brains, better for you than your grains, creamy, steamy seal brains. Rolan and Connor looked at each other, speechless. Tariq stopped singing, restoring his serious face. "I didn't just imagine that, did I?" said Rolan. "Tariq, did you just sing a song about seal brains?" Abeka nodded, her smile broad, showing her startlingly white teeth. "I want to hear another." Tariq looked so serious, Connor was certain he would never admit he'd sung such a song, let alone reprise. "Seal brains," Tariq sang. "Seal brains, my love for them it never strains. Just avoid the stringy veins in your pile of seal—" "I can't do it," he said, putting down the horn cup. "I cannot convince myself to actually eat seal brains." "Now, Tariq," said Rolan, "you're spoiling your hard-earned warrior reputation. Go gnaw on some raw bones, quick." Tariq betrayed a small smile. "When I was growing up, if our mother gave us something unpleasant to eat, my brothers and I would make up a song about it, to convince ourselves it was delicious. It worked well with lima beans and kale, but no song in Erdos can convince me to snack on brains." Abeka took up the cup Tariq had abandoned. "I don't mind it. In my village we ate every part of any animal we managed to hunt, just like the Ardu." As she lifted the spoon to her mouth, her eyes flicked to Rolan. Connor saw him nod a little. Rolan and Abeka seemed to share the experience of having to appreciate every last morsel of food. Growing up, life hadn't been a banquet for Connor either, but he'd never starved. Even in the direst of times, there'd always been mutton, acorn and bulrush bread, wild asparagus, and boiled clover and dandelion. But in Abeka's arid Okaihi, or in Rolan's cobbled Concorba, there would have been few wild plants to gather or sheep to slay. Connor realised, even in his poverty, he'd been lucky. But did his family have mutton now? Last he'd heard from home, times were troubled. They'd lost some sheep and weren't likely to have one spare. He bit into a purple slice of liver and tried to appreciate it on behalf of his family. The feast went on all evening, slice after slice of meat and fat, bits of organ meat offered up on bone knives. Then the rest of the seals, chopped up and slowly cooked over pans of burning seal fat, were offered in small bowls. Lastly, the women passed around small pink rolls, which earned satisfied cheers from the Ardu. Connor took a bite and realised it was more seal fat, mixed perhaps with flour and something sweet. Connor surprised himself by taking a second.
Seal fat sweet cakes, said Roland, just like Mama used to make.
Roland winced at his own joke for some reason and turned away, suddenly despondent. Connor supposed thinking about a mother reminded him that he didn't have one of his own. Connor's own heart pinched, thinking of his mother and what she might be doing right now.
We thank you for this magnificent feast,
Tariq said, loudly enough to be heard over the drums.
Especially the seal brains,
Roland whispered.
Tariq cleared his throat. We are on an urgent mission for the safety of all Erdas. We seek Suka.
At once the drumming stopped. In the silence, Connor became aware of the sharp sound of wind chiseling away at the tundra.
We do not talk of Suka, said the Ardu man. You may sleep here tonight. In the morning, you should go.
The Ardu showed the group to their ice huts, their mouths shut as if there would be no more conversation. Connor crawled on his hands and knees to get through the narrow opening of the offered ice hut. Once inside, he was surprised how warm and quiet the room was. It wasn't tall enough to stand in, but he sat comfortably on the flat ground, atop a pile of caribou hides. The others joined him, all spirit animals in passive form in the tight space. Except Essex, of course.
Essex saw another settlement like this one a ways in that direction, and a third that way, said Roland, pointing at 2 corners of their hut.
Yeah, brigands seem to smell people off that way too, said Connor. It'd have to be a lot of people to smell that far off, I think.
He didn't mention that he thought he'd smelled people when the wind came from that direction as well. Maybe his sense of smell was sharpening, but the others might think that a little creepy. Why are they separated like that? Asked Maylin. Why not all settle together? Maybe they don't get along, said Abeka. Or maybe they're posted here like guards, watching over something that's in the centre, said Maylin.
The Ice City, maybe? Said Connor.
Isn't this the Ice City? Maya asked.
I doubt it, said Tariq. It's small and looks recently built. Hopefully in the morning, after the feasting, the Ardu will be content and disposed to tell us what they know of the legendary Ice City. But no one mentions Suka again.
Connor and Roland both yawned at the same time and then laughed.
Let's get some sleep, said Tariq.
Chapter 9. Ice City. Abeka didn't sleep. She could picture the Ardu village and the location of the other 2 settlements Essex had spotted. The 3 settlements formed a triangle. Briggan had smelled a lot of people, and Abeka smelled something fishy. The positions of the settlements reminded Abeka of how her villagers had hunted a hippopotamus once. The drought was high, and food was rare. 3 groups of hunters surrounded a water hole where hippos came to drink. They moved in slowly till the hippo had nowhere to run. The Ardu were hunters too, and they'd surrounded something they didn't want anyone else to know about. When Tariq had asked about Suka, the singing and drumming and smiles had stopped. clearly Suka was something they didn't want anyone to know about. Abeka glanced at the sleeping forms in the hut. She didn't want to wake anyone. Besides, it would feel really great to be a hero for once, to run back to camp and let everyone know she'd found Suka. She was still wearing her coat and gloves. She picked up her bow and quiver and crept out the door. Once outside, she released Uraza. "I know it's cold," Abeka whispered, "but I need your added stealth. Help me find Suka?" Uraza shivered, whisking her tail back and forth several times. Abeka led her to a small pile of seal meat she'd saved in the snow. Uraza grabbed it with her sharp teeth and in 3 quick movements swallowed it all. She licked Abeka, sniffed the air, and padded out of the village. A light snow was falling over Arctica. Flakes as tiny as pinpricks twirled out of the way of Abeka's breath. With Uraza active, her whole body felt tight, agile, light as snow. When her boots stepped on the thin, fresh layer on the ice, the snow made no sound. Even if it had, the Ardu had seemed especially drowsy after all that feasting. She suspected they'd sleep well tonight. As soon as the ice huts were behind them, Uraza and Abeka ran. Through the clouds, the moon offered a dim blue glow. Abeka kept her gaze sharp, but Uraza noticed something before she did. The leopard slowed to a loping gait. Abeka followed. An ice hole, but not like the breath holes they'd found earlier. There was no water beneath the ice here. This hole seemed deep and empty. As she crouched beside it, Abeka could see what looked like stairs cut into the ice, going down. Abeka held her breath to listen, and realized someone had followed her. She could hear the occasional crack of ice behind her, the hush as the soft layer of snow atop the ice was pressed by a small boot. Uraza sniffed the air, but didn't seem bothered. Someone Abeka knew then. But if it was one of the group, why follow her in secret? Why not simply catch up and ask what she was doing? Abeka's stomach hardened as she realized the answer. It was someone who didn't trust her, who wanted to spy on her, someone who suspected her of being the enemy. Abeka wondered what to do. Hide and then jump out? No, she didn't want any unpleasant confrontation. She just wanted to find Suka's talisman so they could all get out of this freezing cold nightmare. Uraza pressed against her leg, her shivering body a silent plea. So Abeka stood and turned around, whispering into the dark, "Meilin, is that you?" There was no response, but after a few moments, Meilin came forward out of the blue darkness. Usually, Meilin stood with chin high, eyes challenging. Now her face tilted down and she didn't meet Abeka's eyes. Abeka pretended not to notice her embarrassment. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered. "I suspected something was down here. Hopefully Suka. Shall we look together?" Abeka started down the steps. She tensed, waiting for Meilin to confront her, accuse her. When Meilin just wordlessly followed behind, Abeka finally exhaled. The stairs kept going down. Above was darkness. Below was darkness. But she followed Uraza, who seemed confident that there was a way forward, not just a drop into nothing. The heels of Abeka's boots couldn't find purchase. She stepped lightly on her toes, her thighs aching as her feet tried to grip the treacherous ice. And then with a slip and a swoosh, she was horizontal, her feet flying out from beneath her. She hit the icy stairs and began to roll, striking down against one after another, darkness pulling her down, no sense of how long she would fall, no idea where she would land. She slammed into a warm, furry body. She seized Uraza around her neck and heard the leopard's claws squeaking as she dug into the ice. But Abeka's fall stopped. She kept gripping Uraza's thick fur, steadying herself as she got back on her feet and still clung as they eased down the remainder of the stairs into a pale-lit corridor Maylin, Abeka whispered up the dark stairs. Be careful,
Maylin came into view, sliding down the icy stairs on her backside. Her chin was up as if daring Abeka to mock her. Abeka let the corner of her mouth rise a little. Maylin's smile twitched in response. They tiptoed through a narrow ice tunnel. It opened up, and both Abeka and Maylin gasped. A long and narrow fissure had once cracked the ice, creating a huge underground canyon so long Abeka couldn't see its end. A thin layer of ice created a roof over it, like the kind that had concealed the crevasses of the tundra. The moon bled pale light through it, lightly illuminating the space with blue and silver.
The Ice City, Maylin whispered. It's underground.
Abeka nodded. She didn't dare make a sound. Though she couldn't see anyone, Uraza was sniffing the air in the way she did when sensing people. A lot of people. First, Abeka noticed that it felt warmer down here, though perhaps that was just protection from the cold Arctican breezes. Second, she realized how quiet it was. All that ice muffled noises. Her own heartbeat seemed loud compared to the stillness around her, filling her ears, insistent as the Ardu drums. Only the occasional crinkling and cracking of ice stirred the air, as ice never seemed completely at rest. She left the tunnel and entered the Ice City. The rift was much larger than the crevasses Maylin and Rolan had fallen into on their journey. This rift had cut a long, deep section of solid ice in two. Carved into each side of the ice walls was a city. Abeka walked down the narrow sidewalk of one side of the rift. Like apartments in a city tenement, room after room had been cut into the cliff. There were no straight edges. Everything was in arches and curves. Doorways were draped with hides. Abeka peered through a thinner layer of clear ice that served as a window. The inside of the room looked like a small home, with a table and chairs carved from ice, and a great chunk for an ice bed. It was empty. Many were empty, but in some homes, people slept on the beds, wrapped with caribou hides.
How is it glowing? Maylin whispered.
Abeka shrugged. It should be dark down below, but a twilight silver graced every surface. Somehow the builders must have known how to best carve the ice so that it soaked up and reflected the little moon and starlight that trickled down. Every piece of ice was carved. The ground bore the carvings of fine cobblestones. The great icicles hanging down were etched with intricate patterns. The front walls of the homes bore faces of women and children, of great warriors and hunters, of Arctican animals. The walls were frozen tapestries, the blocks of ice magnificent sculptures. Hundreds of years of carving showed everywhere Abeka looked. Ice bridges spanned the crevasse. Abeka and Maylin crossed over, the arched bridge creaking quietly beneath their boots. In the opposite side they found more houses and structures carved into the ice walls, and frozen art in abundance. What's more, they found stairs leading down. Deeper seemed safer, and surely that's where Suka would be. So they descended and discovered another story of the Ice City. More houses and structures and art. More stairs and yet another story and another, so that it seemed there would be no end. Deeper they descended. The air seemed warmer still, though Abeka wondered if she was imagining it. Then the ice ended, and instead of ice, the rest of the city was carved from rock. No ice tapestries here, no sculptures, just walkways and stairs cut out of dark brown stone. They were so deep, Abeka wondered if they were in the center of the world. She felt pressure swelling inside her ears. Deeper into the rock city, the air was definitely warmer. Uraza panted happily.
Abeka glanced at Maylin to see if she would release G now that she wouldn't suffer from the cold. Maylin lifted one eyebrow, perhaps guessing her thoughts. G remained a mark on Maylin's arm. Abeka and Maylin took off their coats and gloves, carrying the huge bundles under their arms. Torches lit the darker space, oil-soaked fur on bones crackling with fire. Finally they reached the bottom. They found pools of water, warm air stirring above it, and Abeka imagined how heavenly it would feel to bathe in such water. Surely the inhabitants of the Ice City used this lower level to wash, to drink and cook and thaw out from the harsh Arctican climate. If she had bonded with a snow leopard instead of Uraza, she could imagine finding this place a paradise.
Suka is supposed to be frozen in ice, Maylin whispered.
Abeka nodded agreement. They wouldn't find Suka down here. She pointed back up. So they climbed stairs till Abeka's legs shook, and she wondered if, before Uraza, she would have had the strength to climb all night long. But even without whatever aid G offered her, Maylin didn't slow. She'd always been tough, but since her father's death, Maylin seemed to be pure, quivering energy. At the first ice story, they took to the walkways and continued forward, the long narrow rift extending for perhaps a mile. Uraza's ears pricked up, and she stopped suddenly, Abeka and Maylin halting behind her. Abeka could hear it. People. A mutter, a rustle, a few sleeping people turning over in their sleep. But they'd passed hundreds of apartments. Every Ardu living in icy Arctica had a spirit animal. If Maylin and Abeka were discovered, if the city woke and attacked the intruders, Abeka didn't think they'd have a chance. But the noise quieted, and Uraza continued on. At last they reached the end of the rift and were faced with the facade of an enormous ice building.
A palace, Maylin whispered. The Ice Palace, said Abeka.
The exterior of the palace was thick, the ice a deep greenish white, except for the windows which were layered with thin, transparent, glass-like ice. The structure rose many stories high, supported by thick ice pillars, carved with twining, frosty vines, topped with a triangular roof in a brilliant, pure white. There was no door in the doorway. They entered. A great hall greeted them, tiles carved in the floor, delicate pillars holding the roof, a grand staircase with a huge chandelier of ice hanging above it all. Abeka knew she would never have time to explore each room, examine all the carved artwork in the walls, the details in each pillar and frozen furniture. No time to explore, because they had already found what they'd sought. In the center of the great hall waited the polar bear. Chapter 10. Frozen. Suka did not move, did not blink, did not roar. With held breath and pounding heart, it took Maylin several seconds to realize the bear was sealed inside a perfectly clear block of ice. She walked around the huge block. It was the size of a barn. She focused on the ice itself, its marvelous clear color, how smooth its surface was, as if it had been polished by water. Fear nudged her heart, and she admitted to herself that she was avoiding looking fully at the polar bear.
I am my father's daughter, she thought. I do not fear.
Though thick, the ice was as clear as glass. She steadied her breathing and examined one bare paw. The strands of white fur caught as if in a breeze, the 5 curved black claws, each longer than Maylin's entire hand. Maylin braced herself and looked up. Suka had been upright when frozen, standing on her back legs, her front legs lifted, in welcome or defiance, Maylin couldn't tell. She bent her neck back, trying to see Suka's head.
Up here, Abeka whispered.
Abeka was standing at the top of the stairway. Maylin followed, counting the stairs as she climbed. 35. On the landing of the second story, they stood right at eye level with Suka. She seemed to be staring at them, her black eyes open, though so still. Her mouth was slightly gaping, and Maylin could see her long yellow teeth. Maylin calculated that 5 people standing on each other's shoulders would be about the same height as Suka, though not as wide or heavy, or as clawed or toothy or deadly. Was it wise to wake such a beast?
Look,
Abeka whispered, her voice full of awe. Maylin saw. Tied with a cord to Suka's left paw was a blue crystal carved in the shape of a polar bear.
Her talisman,
Maylin whispered. Perhaps they wouldn't have to wake Suka. If they could just break through the ice and reach the talisman.
We need Maya,
said Maylin. Abeka glanced around, peeking in a few rooms.
There doesn't seem to be an exit through the ice palace. We'll have to go back the way we came, through the city,
said Maylin. Abeka nodded.
I can wait here, guard Suka, while you get the others.
Maylin's skin was already covered in goosebumps from the cold and the frightening thrill of encountering this great beast. But at Abeka's words, the hairs on her arms stood up even higher. She looked at Abeka, trying to gauge her expression, read her eyes for any thoughts of treachery.
Maybe I should stay instead,
Maylin started. Abeka sighed.
Maylin,
I've tried everything I know. I left home. I left the Conquerors. I joined the Greencloaks. I've slept beside you and fought beside you. What else can I do to earn your trust? Maylin felt anger bubble inside her. The sight of Abeka's face, innocent eyes, half concealed by darkness, made her fists curl. Abeka, whose family was safe and alive in Nilo. Abeka who had hugged Shane. Abeka who might be conspiring with the enemy. Someone had to be responsible for what happened to her father. Someone who Maylin could strike, make bleed, make pay. But she didn't need G here calming her thoughts and helping her focus her mind to realize that someone wasn't Abeka. You stand watch, said Maylin. I'll go. Maylin ran all the way back through the sleeping city and up the narrow stairway. She emerged into a stiff Arctican breeze, the noise startling after the near silence of the underground. Pulling her hood back up, she ran to the village, thinking how Abeka would be better at this, stealthier, less likely to arouse the Ardu. Why had she wanted Maylin to do it? Could Abeka have a way of melting or cutting through that ice? Maylin stopped in the center of a snowy field and looked back. The camp was far closer now than the ice city. She continued on, though her heartbeats stung and her mouth went dry with fear.
Hurry,
she whispered to Tariq, Connor, Maya and Rolan.
Put on your gear. Quiet. We found Suka.
The 4 didn't ask a question. They just started putting on boots and coats. In moments they were off again into the snow. Maylin glanced back. Tariq's otter, Lumio, was in his active state, a small pointed head peering out of the neck of Tariq's coat. Maya's salamander was no doubt keeping warm and out of sight as well. Briggan ran beside Connor, occasionally biting at the wind. Essex was nowhere to be seen. And the entrance to the ice city felt miles away. Maylin's heart beat harder. Had she made a mistake? Doubt seared through her. Perhaps Abeka had tricked her, played on her emotions to get Maylin to leave her alone. When she returned, the crystal polar bear would be gone. Abeka would be gone. Maylin would be less trustworthy than Connor, who gave a talisman over to the Conquerors. and she would be that much further from avenging her father. Maylin ran in front, and when she began to descend down the hidden steps, she heard someone gasp in surprise. The gasps continued when they emerged from the narrow tunnel into the city itself. "The song," Connor whispered. "The city artists made. The carved city. This is it." Maylin put her finger to her lips and pointed at the nearest window, indicating that they weren't alone. Roland's eyes widened, and Tariq peered through briefly, but they all resisted slowing to marvel at the city, following Maylin as quickly as they dared. The ice walkways had been carefully scored with cobblestone shapes, which minimized slipping, but it was still ice underfoot, and the ravine just to the side of the walkway led so far down that only darkness stared back up. They hurried on in quick, careful steps. What would happen if the city dwellers awoke and found them trespassing? What would happen if Abeka and the talisman were gone? More gasps behind her when Maylin led them to the ice palace and to the pedestal of Suka. Maylin's middle felt as frozen as the city as she walked around the other side. No hole in the ice. The crystal polar bear still tied to Suka's frozen paw. Abeka stood on the stairs. Abeka smiled at Maylin, and Maylin exhaled and smiled back. "There," Abeka said, pointing to the left paw. "Maya, can you extract that?" Connor and Roland were just standing there, staring up at the huge beast, their mouths open. Maylin rolled her eyes, but suspected she'd worn a similar expression when she first laid eyes on the monstrosity. Tariq was running his hands over the ice, walking around the block as if measuring.
"We could never hack through this, not without—"
"Waking the whole city," Abeka finished.
"Yes, I don't think the Ardu hospitality would survive if they discovered us trying to cut into Suka's icy prison,"
said Tariq. The 4 teammates looked around, catching one another's eyes. Maylin felt that they were all thinking, as she was, of past cities, past communities like Samus who just wanted to keep things as they were. But Erdos had already changed, and nothing could stay as it always had been. Not in Zhong, not in Trunswick, not even in the wilds of Amaya. Not anywhere for long. The Devourer's reach was long. Maylin was sorry to trespass on the Ardu, but she knew, like Connor, Roland and Abeka seemed to know, that no one was safe unless the Devourer was stopped. She believed in their mission. Collect power, protect the talismans, prepare to fight. "Here?" asked Maya, pointing to the crystal polar bear.
Tariq nodded. "As much as I'd like to meet Suka, I am hesitant to expose any of you to a beast that size."
"Look at those claws," Roland whispered. "They're as long as butter knives. Sharp butter knives. No, meat knives."
"If we can free the talisman without waking Suka,"
Tariq began.
"Come look at her teeth,"
Connor called from atop the stairs. "Okay, everyone, here it goes," said Maya. She'd climbed halfway up the stairs and removed her caribou fur glove from her right hand. A fist-sized ball of light formed over her palm. As Maylin watched, the pale yellow light spun, shades of orange and red streaking and pulsing together. Maya took a deep breath and blew. A thin stream of fire shot out, burrowing into the solid ice. A rivulet streamed down, forming a pool on the icy floor. A narrow hole about 2 finger lengths deep was scored into the ice, pointing at the talisman. "Well, about 20 more of those should do it," Maya said brightly. She held up her palm and started again. While she worked, Connor and Roland walked around the barn-sized block, gawking at Suka.
"I dare you to touch it," Roland whispered. "You first," Connor whispered back. I'll carry your pack for 3 days if you lick it.
Connor actually seemed to consider. Boys, Malin muttered. Scattered around the ground at the base of the huge block lay knitted clothes, intricately carved walrus tusks, necklaces of ivory beads, gifts the Ardu had laid at Suka's feet. Malin walked along the upper story, searching for a possible exit up to the ground. The ice palace was full of rooms, ballrooms, drawing rooms, bedrooms, all hollowed out of the solid ice and full of carved furniture. She imagined that, long ago, Suka somehow flooded this area with water, perhaps carving a channel from the ocean, and then submerging herself, allowing herself to freeze deep underground. Perhaps the Ardu found frozen Suka years later when exploring the Great Rift, and began to carve out a palace around her, and beyond that, a city. Year after year, sculpting and carving, turning every inch into a work of art. How must it be to live near a thing so awesome and fearsome as this great beast? Malin found no stairway up to the tundra, but she was just about to explore a room full of statues, animals of Arctica carved in huge columns of ice, when she heard Tariq shout.
Wait!
Malin started at the noise. Till now, everyone had been so quiet. She hurried back to the landing. Maya was standing with a ball of flame over her palm. She shook her hand, the fire dissolving into the air, and looked at Tariq with frightened eyes.
Wait,
Tariq said, whispering now.
It's cracking.
Around the hole, tiny splinters had formed with each enlargement. Thin white lines radiated out from the hole Maya had burned into the thick ice. But now Malin noticed 2 larger cracks moving away from the hole. Slowly, but moving, spreading, reminding Malin of the time she'd pressed her thumb alongside a crack in a window pane and made it grow longer. Maya had stepped back, as if waiting for the cracks to stop. But they didn't. They kept growing, as if something was pressing, from the inside. Everyone was still, breaths held, watching. Malin was on the 2nd level. She was at just the right spot to look into Suka's eyes, so she saw the moment that Suka looked back. Malin gasped and took a step away. She's... Malin started.
Don't,
Tariq said. Maya dropped her hands and backed up the stairs. Only Roland moved forward.
Suka,
he whispered. The shudder came first, then ice cracking, the sound as high and piercing as the shriek of a kestrel. Then the eruption. The entire ice block shattered, shards and chunks exploding out. Everyone ran, ducked, covered their heads with their hands. The gigantic polar bear lifted her paws and roared. Chapter 11. Suka. Roland tried very hard not to soil his pants. He knew Suka was large, but frozen in ice she'd seemed tame somehow. Awake, in motion, she was scarier than street thugs looking for a fight, than a great ram thrashing, than an army of conquerors. Suka seemed to be death itself. There was no intelligence in her eyes, only the wildness of a predator trapped. She lurched, cracking the rest of the ice block into pieces. She roared. The people in the ice city woke, and they screamed.
Suka, wait!
Roland started. Suka staggered again, slamming into a pillar. The ice palace began to come down.
Get out,
Tariq yelled.
Everybody get to the surface.
The great beast roared, lashing out with her monstrous paws. Pillars fell, the ceiling cracked, chunks of ice began falling. The smallest of them could crush Roland into oblivion. They had to get out of the ice palace now, but he also knew if they tried to flee the way they'd come, Suka might follow, and tear apart the Ice City in the process. All those people would be crushed or fall down the rift. No, there had to be another exit. Up. Through a hole Suka had smashed in the ceiling, Roland saw stars. Fallen ice created a heap he might be able to climb to reach the hole in the ceiling. Tariq saw it too.
"Go up!"
Tariq yelled. A huge piece of pillar fell right toward Tariq. At the last moment, he ducked and twisted in a motion that seemed impossible to Roland's eye, barely escaping the falling ice. Maylin and Abeka had been on the landing and were already climbing the icy rubble toward the hole in the ceiling. Beside Uraza, Abeka leaped from block to block with astounding ease. Maylin must have had the granite ram because she jumped in great arches, passing even Abeka. Once up and out of the underground palace, she stooped over the hole and dropped the granite ram down to Maya, who caught it and began to leap up too. Connor was trapped, Suka between him and the way leading up and out. Roland hoped Suka might recognize Briggan as a fellow great beast, but her eyes were all wild animal rage. She swiped at Connor, and he ducked and ran, as fast as Briggan, as fast as a wind-blown leaf. His head low, he barely made it beneath the striking paw and beyond, and began to run up the fallen ice. Everyone was on their way out of the ice palace, but Roland. He'd been on the far side opposite Connor, and was crawling over fallen ice, trying not to draw the bear's notice. Now there was no one left to notice but him. Suka turned, sniffed, and growled.
"Essex!"
Roland yelled.
"Essex, please!"
He did not know what help she could provide. He didn't even know where she was. Suka's paw came down, and the ice floor around Roland began to crack. Tariq paused, halfway up the rubble, and pulled Dinesh's slate elephant from the pack around his neck. He lifted it high, as if he would throw it to Roland, but Roland could see he was too far away. His otter-enhanced abilities didn't include a perfect throwing arm. One more strike from Suka would end everything for Roland. Either she would hit him this time, crushing him to bits, or she'd completely crack the ice around him and send him tumbling down.
"Essex!"
he called again. A falcon screeched. Essex swooped through the hole in the ceiling and down into the crumbling ice palace. She took the slate elephant from Tariq, seizing the gold chain in her talons. The grey stone elephant dangled as she flew, looking heavy beside her petite body. She screeched again, and Suka looked away from Roland to the falcon, swatting at the air. Essex dove, deftly avoiding her strikes, and flew right over Roland. She released the slate elephant, and he caught it. The ground beneath him shuddered, and a crack widened, claiming one of his legs. He tore open the neck of his coat and pushed the talisman in, making contact with his skin. A flash, and Essex was as large as a flying wolf, with a wingspan as long as several grown men are tall. Her shriek was so loud now it cracked ice. Suka put her paws to her ears and roared. Essex swooped, and Roland lifted his hands. The ice shuddered again. He started to fall, his stomach full of butterflies. But he only fell a moment before he lifted again. Essex had snatched his coat at the wrists with her talons and pulled him up, her huge wings thrashing. Suka swatted, just nicking one of Essex's wings. She dipped to one side but caught the air again and rose, barely fitting through the hole in the ceiling. They flew up into the startlingly cold air, all wind and snow, the hint of dawn bleeding yellow into the blue night.
"Yes! Thank you, Essex!"
Roland yelled. Essex shrieked,
"Ow! But not so loud!"
He was out of that underground nightmare, but he wasn't safe. None of them were. From below, more growls and crashes. Suka was tearing the palace apart. Cracks in the ice grew larger as the ground began to cave in. Tariq, Maya, and Connor had been standing nearest the hole, and now they ran away from it, even as its cracks grew larger, seemingly reaching out for them. The Arctican tundra lay flat around them for miles, nowhere to hide. Suka would fight her way out of the collapsing palace. She would be free to pursue them, and would be faster than any could run. "Rolan, give me your Connor the elephant," Abeka shouted from the other side of the hole. "Only Araza or Briggan have a hope of fighting her."
"Are you kidding me?" Roland shouted back from the air. "No one has a hope of fighting her."
Just then, Suka rose up from the collapsing ground. At first only her upper body, but with one push and leap, the huge creature was free, galloping on 4 paws up the ice, straight toward Rolan. Essex lifted again, and Suka rose on her back legs, reaching, swiping the air. Higher Essex flew, but Rolan wondered if it would be high enough. Suka's arms seemed to reach as far as the moon, her claws inches away from his dangling feet. Essex's huge wings kept beating, and she and Rolan rose higher still, leaving Suka to land back on the ice. She swung her head around.
"Find Maylin!" Rolan called to Essex. "We need G, a big G, a G Suka can't ignore."
Rolan couldn't see Maylin anywhere, but Abeka must have had the granite ram now. She was leaping in a huge arc over a crack, much farther than she'd ever be capable of, even with Uraza enhancing her powers. Rolan's arms ached as he dangled from Essex by his wrists, and then suddenly he was falling. Essex had let go. He started to scream. Essex's talons seized him again, this time by the coat on his shoulders. She'd only let go to readjust. The position was far more comfortable.
"Thanks, Essex," Roland said, his voice shivery with nerves. "Glad you still want me to hang around."
Suka was roaring. She lifted a paw to swat Maya. Maya tore her glove off her hand, produced a ball of fire, and blew. A wall of thin fire rushed out from Maya, blocking Suka. The polar bear reared back, her paw flung over her eyes. The fire dissipated quickly in the freezing air. There was nothing to burn, no wood or grasses to set aflame and create a barricade to hide behind. Suka readjusted to attack again. Maya responded with another wall of fire. But this time, Suka raked the ground with her claws, sending boulders of ice crashing through the fire. One struck Maya's leg. She screamed in pain and fell. Tariq picked her up and ran away from the polar bear. Suka blinked and reared her head, looking for a new target. Connor was alone, running from the lengthening cracks in the ground. Suka moved toward him.
"Abeka!" Roland yelled. "Jump to Connor! Get him out of there!"
Abeka crouched to jump, but paused. The hole between her and Connor was even greater now. She couldn't get to him in time.
"Drop me, Essex,"
Roland said, hoping to free Essex to go save Connor. Essex started downward, but Connor was already sliding toward the hole and Suka was getting closer. Essex kept hold of Roland, surely realizing, as Roland did, that she couldn't reach Connor in time. Abeka took out an arrow, tied the talisman to it, and aimed high, perhaps adjusting for the extra weight. She shot the arrow. The arrow struck the ice beside Connor's head. He broke it off, grabbing the talisman just as the ground fell beneath him. Connor jumped. His first leap carried him halfway across the crumbling crevasse, but not far enough. A huge chunk of ice fell below him. He slammed his foot down, pushing against the falling ice for a little more lift, and he leaped again, his arms circling as the ice cliff came closer. He almost made it, one hand reaching out to grab the edge. Abeka was there, grabbing his wrist and pulling him up. Suka crouched on 3 of her paws, the 4th held to her chest, protecting the talisman. She began to run around the huge hole toward Abeka and Connor. Abeka let arrows fly. The bear swatted them out of the air. A few stuck in her thick coat, not even reaching the skin. She shook, the arrows falling with delicate tinks onto the ice. Suka roared and slammed her paws down. Another crack formed in the ice, travelling at terrifying speed toward Abeka. Connor grabbed her hand and leaped, just as the ice beneath their feet ripped apart, ice chunks tumbling down into a new rift.
"Suka, stop!" Roland yelled. Please, Essex, tell her to stop.
He spotted dozens of shapes huddled at the far end of the huge rift, and then he looked closer and found that he could see even clearer.
Thanks, Essex, he muttered.
Roland could make out people emerging from the hidden stairs at the far end of the great rift, where Roland had first followed Maylin into the underground city. They were huddled in blankets, having fled the ice city too fast to dress. Some were barefoot. He also spotted lots of animals: snow foxes, owls, seagulls, caribou, seals, their spirit animals, all likely giving them a hardened ability to withstand the cold. They stood and watched, but they did not come to help. They would not fight Suka. Clearly they were brighter than Roland's crew. And running toward the Ardu, he spotted Maylin.
Essex, there,
Roland said, pointing. The falcon flew Roland with a swoop so low and so fast that Roland's stomach seemed left far behind. His breath tingled with speed and icy air. Essex passed before Maylin, dropping Roland. He landed on the ice feet first, but tipped and rolled before regaining his feet. We need to gather the people from the ice city, said Maylin. Roland ran alongside her to keep up. They have spirit animals. They can fight.
They won't fight Suka, said Roland. They built a palace for her. We need G.
What? Maylin stopped. G can't fight Suka.
Of course not. No one could, not an entire army, said Roland. But maybe G can communicate with her, calm her.
G's a panda, Maylin yelled.
A panda bear. Come on, you have to try, Roland yelled back.
He pulled the slate elephant from against his chest, and above him, circling Essex, returned to her normal size with a muted screech. Maylin's eyes were hot, and she seemed about to argue, but they could hear another Suka roar and shouts from Abeka and Connor. Fine, said Maylin. She tore open the neck of her coat and slid the elephant against her skin, held in place by her many layers of clothing. Then she pushed up the sleeve of her coat. A flash of brightness, a leaping shape, and then G stood before them. Except G was no longer normal panda-sized. She was perhaps almost as large as the great beast had been in her prime. She was gigantic, maybe half the size of Suka. G looked at Maylin, huffed at a snowflake, and shivered. Suka roared, and G slowly turned her head in that direction. She seemed to consider, then looked again at Maylin. Suka is awake and enraged, Maylin said softly. She isn't talking, just trying to kill us. If there's anything you can do. G looked towards Suka again. Two giant bears. One much larger, her clawed paws the size of boulders, her toothy maw like a gaping cave. The other bear smaller, slower, paws for climbing trees, teeth for gently nibbling bamboo, her shoulders shivering in the Arctican wind. G huffed air through her nose, then began ambling toward the commotion. Maylin grabbed the arm of Roland's coat. She doesn't know how to fight. She's going to get killed. I don't want... Her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath. I don't want her to get killed. I don't want anyone else to die. Roland nodded. He reached out, took her gloved hand in his. We have to try, he whispered. Maylin took another shaky breath, looked at him briefly, and her face softened. Okay, she said.
Okay,
he said, and he tried a small smile to show that it would be okay. As one, they ran after G, towards Suka, and shouts and the impossible fight. They ran in lockstep, side by side the whole way, her hand in his. Chapter 12. Polar Bear Attack. Maylin ran. She was conscious of Roland holding her hand, but the thick layers of their caribou hide gloves made the touch feel safe, casual, a comfort. He wasn't trying to hold her, she wasn't trying to pull him. They were just doing the same thing at the same time, running toward danger together. She was grateful for his closeness, because ahead of her, some 800 pounds of enlarged panda were padding toward the most frightening monster Maylin had ever beheld. Maylin wasn't used to this feeling, iciness dripping from her heart into her stomach, her legs weak and shaking. She wasn't used to intense, senseless fear. My father's death weakened me, she thought vaguely. Before her seemingly immortal father's end, death had never seemed truly real. Now it was. Now anyone might die. Maylin herself, Roland, Tariq, even G. G had died before, she might be killed again. A quiver in Maylin's heart warned her that she couldn't stand it. G was almost to Suka. The polar bear was standing on her back legs. She lifted her head to the whitening sky and roared. Maylin felt the roar inside her chest, Suka's confusion and pain vibrating with her own. Her arms felt heavy, as if she were back in Zhong holding her father's body, weighed down with heat and rage. In that moment, without G and her friends to stop her, she would have done anything, hurt anybody. "G, be careful!" Maylin shouted. "Suka's not in her right mind!" Suka slammed back down, her right front paw cracking the ice, her left pressed to her chest, again hiding the talisman. She opened her mouth, exposing teeth as long as Maylin's leg. G didn't stop, stepping around the larger chunks of ice comfortably, slowly and deliberately advancing. She was so large, her black markings were clear against the white background. Suka seemed mesmerized. She growled at the great panda. G stood at Suka's flank and stretched her neck towards Suka as if to touch noses. Suka leaned back, raising a paw. Maylin held her breath. With one swat, that clawed paw could end G. But G didn't duck, didn't retreat. She just looked calmly into the black eyes of certain death. G is brave, Maylin realized. Fearless. G stood on her hind legs too. Suka hesitated, clearly entranced by the sight of that huge panda. The movement of her dark limbs against a world of white, her silver eyes catching the dawning sun. She stretched her neck out from her hunched shoulders. Suka was breathing hard, almost as if she were afraid, but she let G's nose touch hers. Maylin could see the huffing of Suka's chest slow. Her paw lowered without striking. G put one black paw against Suka's heart. Suka dropped to all fours, G beside her. They touched necks. Maylin wondered if through all that thick fur their touch felt much like holding Roland's gloved hand. She realized she was still holding his hand and dropped it, suddenly embarrassed. But she didn't take her eyes from the bears. They were leaning into each other, Suka's eyes closed. Maylin had felt that peace G radiated, at times intensely. Often she had rejected it, preferring to be angry. She held her breath, waiting for Suka to reject it too and attack again. But when Suka opened her huge eyes, they'd lost their wildness. She looked at G, at the crystal polar bear still strapped to her left paw, then around at the various people, crouched, tense, ready to flee, all watching her.
G,
Suka said. Her voice reminded Maylin of growls, of the winds, of ice thousands of years old just starting to crack. It was a wild sound, deep enough to shake her bones, as lonely as an ice mountain in the middle of a tundra, as careful as a snowflake falling.
"Oh, G,"
said Suka.
"What has happened to Erdos?"
G sat back on her hind legs and blinked. Suka nuzzled her neck, inhaling. Then she sat back as well.
"You have returned,"
she said.
"but you are not as you were."
Ji turned her large head to look at Meilin. Sensing a request, Meilin pulled the slate elephant from beneath her coat, showing Suka. Ji flickered in place and returned to her normal size, almost as if her gigantic proportions had just been a trick of the light.
"Ah, Dinesh," said Suka. "I see."
She rubbed her eyes with one paw, as if seeing caused her pain. Rolan approached. Meilin refused to be less courageous than he was and hurried up, walking beside him. She stopped next to Ji, putting her hand into the fur of the panda's neck. She could feel her shivering, but sensed she wouldn't want to go into passive state yet.
"How long was I asleep?"
Suka asked. "Long enough for the Ardu to find you and carve an ice palace around you," Meilin said.
"And an entire ice city beyond that,"
Rolan added. Suka looked to where the Ardu from the ice city stood, far on the other side of the Great Rift.
"The Ardu have always been my people. I hope I didn't hurt them. I feel strange after all that time asleep. My mind, it seems, took longer to wake up."
She looked at Ji.
"Perhaps it never would have, but you were always the healer. When a healer joins a war, all should take notice. I should have taken notice."
Suka's eyes grew distant, as if she could see something miles away beyond the view of anyone else. She breathed deeply.
"Erdas is not what it was. I do not believe even you can heal her."
Ji blinked. Meilin looked for Tariq and Maya, but she couldn't see them. Perhaps Tariq had carried Maya too far away to see that Suka had been subdued. "Suka, as you can see, the four fallen have returned," Meilin said. Connor and Abeka had been edging closer, Briggan and Uraza beside them. Essex settled onto Roland's shoulder. Suka growled, and Meilin flinched, expecting another attack. But after a moment, she realized it was a laugh.
"Their falling was partly what drove me into the ice all those years ago," said Suka. "At my age I should be wise, but I can only see my own folly."
"You hid yourself because you were afraid?" Meilin asked. Suka's head turned to her, mouth slightly open, her long yellow teeth showing, and Meilin flinched. What in all Erdos could such a beast fear? Even calm, Suka was not safe. Perhaps Roland felt her shudder because he leaned closer to whisper,
"Next time, I'd like to meet a nice, cuddly great beast, perhaps a giant bunny."
"I was afraid in a way," Suka was saying. "The death of the four reminded all of us that not even great beasts are completely immortal. I'd hoped by freezing myself I might prolong my own life. But more, I hoped to keep—" She lifted her paw to look at the talisman and then pressed it back against her middle. "I'd hoped to keep my talisman out of evil hands." She adjusted herself, and Ji went closer, sitting beside her huge leg. She looked up, and Meilin noticed Suka's breath, white against the air, slowly exhaling. Ji's presence was comforting her, encouraging her to go on. "I should have fought beside you, Ji," Suka said, her voice low and frightening. "And with you, Briggan, Uraza, Essex, what power I could have brought to you." She slammed her paw on the ice, making cracks. "Regret drove me into the ice, too. We great beasts have a stewardship over Erdos, but a love of our own lives. The prideful belief that we'd always be greater than any man-driven rabble blinded us, blinded me. You know, before I froze myself, Hallowir the eagle came to me, asking to borrow my talisman. I sent him on his way, minus a few tail feathers." Suka laughed, the sound like an avalanche, but quickly her eyes saddened. "But I had to ask myself, What did Hallowea want with my talisman? I imagined what would happen if another devourer arose and renewed the war, but this time, holding all the talismans of power. I grew warier and warier. Better to remove myself from the world, preserve my life, and keep my talisman away from the devourer and his conquerors. But it was a useless act, wasn't it, G?
G looked up at her and blinked. She nodded.
You're asking for my talisman too, aren't you? You, like Hallowea, want my power.
G looked at Mei Lin. She took a deep breath and spoke. It isn't power we want, Suka. It's safety, for all of Erdos. There was a pause, and for a moment nothing could be heard but Suka's slow breathing and the hushed groan of ice settling. Roland cleared his throat.
Dinesh gave us his slate elephant, as you saw. Arax would not give us the granite ram, but the conquerors saw it too, and we managed to take it to keep it out of their hands. They have also claimed the iron boar.
Suka snorted in anger. Her exhale was strong enough to push Mei Lin's hood off her head. Please, Suka, said Mei Lin. I don't think there's any point in hiding. Zhong has already fallen. We're all forced to take a side. I chose the green cloaks and a fight for... She looked at G. For peace. The word felt comical to Mei Lin, dramatic, a child's wish. Yet as she said it, she believed with a burning in her limbs that peace was the only thing worth fighting for.
If the good guys don't get your talisman, the bad guys will,
said Roland. Suka stared at him. Mei Lin noticed that Roland flinched, but he straightened his shoulders and met the beast's gaze. Suka exhaled again, this time ruffling the fur around Roland's hood.
Perhaps it's time for Erdos to enter a new age, said the polar bear. Perhaps humans have become wise enough to be her stewards.
Suka lifted her paw to her teeth. With a snap, the cord broke. She caught the crystal polar bear with her other paw and handed it to Roland. He lifted his gloved hands and reached over Suka's great claws to retrieve the talisman. Mei Lin noticed that his hands were shaking, but promised herself to never tease him about it.
Thank you,
Roland said, his voice husky with emotion. Suka rose up.
I will go. It's been ages since I ate.
Mei Lin heard Connor barely whisper, I have an extra seal fat sweet cake in my pocket.
And I need to think, Suka said. Times are changing. War is here. There will be a last stand. Do not be foolish, young ones. As you say, there is no hiding.
Suka bent over and gently touched noses again with G. Now G's whole body was barely the size of the polar bear's head. The comparison reminded Mei Lin of a soft panda doll she'd had as a child. That had been a different life, a different Mei Lin. The memory of her old safe bed with the plush panda startled Mei Lin with sudden sorrow. Then, without further warning, Suka ran, her 4 paws sending thunder through the ice. She headed north so quickly that in moments she was out of sight.
3 talismans now,
Roland whispered, examining the crystal polar bear.
Well done,
said Tariq. Mei Lin turned. She hadn't realized Tariq had joined them. He stood behind, holding Maya in his arms. Her face was pained, her leg bound. G? Mei Lin asked. G lumbered over to Maya. Tariq laid her on the ground and carefully pulled up her pant leg. Maya flinched. The calf was already showing bruising, red and purple clouding her pale skin. And from the pain etched on Maya's face, Mei Lin guessed it was broken. G sniffed again, and then licked her calf as a mother cat might clean her kitten. Maya tensed and bit her lip, straightening her leg. You should probably still splint it, said Mei Lin, and be careful. I'm not sure G's power can heal a broken bone, but her touch might help it heal on its own a little faster. What does it do? Abeka asked, indicating the talisman in Rolan's hands.
Let's find out,
said Rolan. He considered, then offered it up to Maylin. She blinked, surprised.
Go ahead,
he said. But Suka gave it to you, Maylin said. That means something.
She gave it to us,
Rolan said.
And you are a part of us.
Surely he meant all of them, the group. But when Rolan said us, she heard you and me, Rolan and Maylin. The thought startled her heart. He tossed the talisman to her, and she caught it. Sometimes back in Zhong, boys had offered Maylin flowers. In public, she'd been the general's daughter, pretty, wealthy, harmless. She'd taken the flowers with a bow, but secretly scorned those scrub-faced boys who only paid her attention because their parents encouraged them to make nice with the daughter of a powerful man. And here was Rolan, the street orphan, Essex on his shoulder, in the middle of icy Arctica, offering her not a flower, but a talisman of great power. And she was no longer the daughter of a powerful man. She was just Maylin. She bowed to him as she would have to those bouquet boys, and she slipped the talisman inside her coat, placing the cold crystal against her skin. At once she felt larger, stronger somehow. Her arms seemed to move differently. She lifted her hand, and Abeka fell over as if pushed by wind. "Whoa!" said Maylin. "Better stand back." They backed away from her. Maylin moved farther from Maya, and then she punched the air. The strength was thrilling. Her arms seemed to be longer, stronger, enlarged with huge boxing gloves made of wind. Her reach was long, the power behind her strike tremendous. She laughed. "This is a little dangerous for close quarters," she said. "But with this talisman, I think I could stand on the ground and knock a conqueror right off his horse."
"Or steal a pie off a second-story windowsill," said Rolan. "I mean, not that I would do that sort of thing, now that I'm an upstanding hero and all."
She smiled and reached out, gently tapping Rolan on the chest from 12 feet away.